Do you want to learn how to buy a used motorcycle? Stay tuned for today's episode. Real quick, if this is your first time visiting the channel, please take a moment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and just know that your support is always appreciated. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could all just go out there and buy the brand new motorcycle that we want? Unfortunately, that's not reality for most of us, and also, I've trained a bunch of newcomers to the sport over the past 3 years, and most of them are actually going to get their feet wet or have got their feet wet by buying a used motorcycle. So that's why I'm here. That's what prompted me to make this video, and I'm going to list some things that you should look for, or perhaps more appropriately, look out for when you're face to face and on the cusp of buying that used motorcycle from a private seller or a dealership. The first thing I ask for or look for from a private seller or a dealer is a title or a certificate of ownership or some sort of document that says, hey, this person used to own it and now we can transfer ownership to you. If you don't have that and they just want to give you a bill of sale, usually I'm out, end of story. Next thing I'm usually looking for is documentation. And when I say documentation, the owner's manual is a nice place to start. If they have that, I want to see if they've logged any of their maintenance, any repairs. They have receipts from reputable dealerships or motorcycle shops for repairs, but most importantly, how often did you perform the oil changes? Did you service the suspension? Did you grease the linkage, the steering head, so on and so forth? So I would like to see some documentation. If there's none of that, it's going to be a pretty tough sell for me the rest of the way. If we can get through the first two steps, the next thing I want to do is just assess the bike visually. Look, does it look like it's been ridden hard? Is it beat up? Is it worn? Are there parts missing or torn off? I've seen it all, but look, some places, some environments are harsher than others and will wear bikes out prematurely. So kind of assess the bike and say to yourself, would I be proud to own this bike today, or does it need some TLC? Once I've assessed the bike visually, kind of overall, I start to break it down piece by piece, if you will. And the first place I look is the tires. And to be honest with you, if the tires are 50% or better, we're good to go. But if somebody's trying to sell you a bike with shot tires, I think that speaks volumes about one, the owner, and two, perhaps the condition of other things on the bike, which we'll get into. But look, it's not hard to rack up a $200, $300 bill just for buying new tires. So if you think you're getting a smoking deal on a used bike and you've immediately got to dump $300 into it for brand new tires, look, you're off to a bad start and perhaps in the hole. While I'm checking out the tires, it doesn't hurt to scope out the wheels, make sure that all the spokes are there, and try to move each wheel from side to side and just see if there's any play. If there's a substantial amount of play there in either wheel, that's a sign that your wheel bearings could be shot. Don't forget to inspect the chain and the sprockets because look, a new set could cost you well over $200, and again, you don't want to start off in the hole, but make sure you inspect that chain for rust or damage. And if you're wondering if it's actually worn out, try to pull that chain off the rear sprocket. To properly adjust a chain that isn't shot, you shouldn't be able to create much separation between that chain and the rear sprocket. While you're back there, take a look at the rear sprocket bolts and the nuts. It's not uncommon for people to round those off. That could be a source of frustration for you in the future. Make sure you go take a look at the counter shaft. Is the seal leaking? Is there any funny business going on up there with the actual counter shaft welded to the spline or something like that? I've seen it all. So again, make sure you go through the chain and sprockets before you buy the bike. So we've come this far. We've got a rolling chassis. We're confident in the bike so far. I want to make sure that the bike has the proper components to help us stop. So this is a good time to inspect the brakes, take a look at the pads, take a look at the lines, and maybe even test it out. Just make sure that the brakes are fully functioning before you buy a used bike. Next thing, make sure you get a look at the air box and the air filter before you buy a used bike. Look, if somebody's trying to sell me a used bike with a dirty air filter, it's not that big of a deal. I can clean it pretty easily, but it again speaks volumes about the seller. And I would be concerned about how well they performed or how often they performed routine maintenance on their bike. Just a couple more things here you should look at. Fork seals, I always look at these when I'm purchasing a used bike. If they're leaking, it's not a big deal if you know how to fix it. It is going to cost you some money in fluids and seals and wipers and so on and so forth. But if you don't know how to make this repair, if you don't know how to make this fix on a fork or both forks, you're easily going to rack up a few $100s in labor and probably another $100 in supplies. So think about that. Make sure you inspect the fork seals. On to the exhaust, and this one should be a no-brainer, but I want to hear the bike run, and I want to hear it run at different RPMs. I want to know if there's a problem with the exhaust or if there's a bearing out in the engine or something like that. So let's make sure the bike runs, and let's make sure the exhaust is in good working order. Nice little bonus if the exhaust is a spark arrestor or Forest Service approved, especially if you ride off-road, because that is required in most OHV areas. If you're just racing at the track, that's probably not a big deal to you, but it's a nice touch if the exhaust you're buying, or at least a muffler, is Forest Service approved. The last thing I want to take a peek at when I'm looking at buying a used bike is the underside of the bike, the frame rails. And look, if they've got a skid plate on it, we're probably good to go. But if they don't, I want to inspect those. You do not want to buy a bike that has damage to the frame or the frame rails or cracks or anything like that. So make sure you take a look at that. If they'll let you, maybe you can take a peek in the radiator just to make sure everything's cool in there. But aside from that, that's pretty much the bike inspection for me. Now that you've had a chance to thoroughly inspect the bike, if you're still convinced that this is the motorcycle for you, it's time to negotiate. Recall everything that you saw that looked out of place, that needed repaired, that needed fixed, and see if the seller is willing to meet you in the middle on a price that works out for both parties. And look, most of the stuff I discussed here today isn't a deal breaker on a sale if the seller is actually willing to negotiate with you. If the bike needs new brake pads, I get it, they wear out. You need a new chain and sprocket, same thing. There's a lot of wear products on the bike, but when those things are shot, you have a little bit of negotiating leverage, in my opinion, and I try to exercise that every time I buy a used bike. Again, if the seller doesn't want to negotiate with me, I'm probably going to walk away and move on to the next bike. Odds are they'll call you back in a few days when their leads have dried up and see if you're still interested. Time for me to get out of here, everybody, but if you have any more questions about buying a used motorcycle, don't be afraid to shoot me an email, benmotorcycleadventures@gmail.com. Just want to extend my thanks. I appreciate everybody tuning in this week. Stay safe out there, keep it on two wheels, and we'll catch you with another new video next week.